Hey there folks, the #1 Cyndi Lauper fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in my Rock Hall Review series for 2025. What is the Rock Hall Review series, you may understandably be asking? It's a yearly series I do on this channel where I talk about each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, review one album by them that I've never talked about on the channel before, and then talk about if I think that they should get in and if I think that they will or will not get in. Two questions that have very different answers more frequently than you would expect. Is this entire series just an excuse for me to talk about my niche interest in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, an institution with no inherent value other than, again, my micro interest in it? Yes, absolutely, but shut up, because today we're talking about She's So Unusual by Cyndi Lauper, one of the most iconic debut albums of the entirety of the 1980s. Cyndi Lauper's debut album is pretty much what her entire career is built off of. I mean, sure, you can say that about a lot of debut albums across every genre of music, but it really applies here. She's So Unusual, both visually and sonically, is one of the most iconic pop albums of an entire decade, arguably of the entire 20th century, and plus it produced two of the most beloved pop songs of all time, the meaningful and more slow Time After Time, and the jovial female empowerment anthem Girls Just Wanna Have Fun, a song so era-defining that most people don't even realize that it was originally written and recorded, albeit never fully released, don't quote me on that, by none other than Robert Hazard, ironically a dude. And you know what, I'm just gonna get it out of the way because everyone has heard those songs and discussed those songs enough that I don't need to really do that here. Time After Time and Girls Just Wanna Have Fun are two of the best pop songs of all time. Perfect songs. They are just perfection. Time After Time and Girls Just Wanna Have Fun are not just some of the best pop songs of the 80s, but just two of the best songs of the entire century, I would argue, as far as pop music goes anyway, mainstream pop music. If you force me to make a top 100 songs of the 80s across all genres, all degrees of popularity, I genuinely do believe that I would put both of those songs on there. They are that great, and they've held up that well in the decades since their initial release. Two of the best singles of the decade, no question for me. And you know what? They may be brilliant tracks that outshine the rest of this record for most of its runtime, but at the same time, the rest of the album's pretty great. After all, a step down from perfection is still pretty damn good most of the time. Cyndi may not be the most technical vocalist in the world, but I'll be damned if she isn't wildly charming throughout this record. I mean, whether she's doing the sort of tongue-in-cheek, sultry self-pleasure anthem, She Bop, or the upbeat album opener, Money Changes Everything, she's just constantly super endearing and dialed in as a likable and easily connectable personality. The kind of artist that you just like genuinely. You don't find them to be some sort of pop star diva type, you don't find them to be some sort of rock star type, just a normal person with a bubbly persona on stage and behind the mic. And that makes for a record that is super engaging, with a unique and memorable voice, personality, and you know what? Some instrumentals here are pretty good as well. I mean, sure, this album is very much of its era, and those sort of funky bass tones and synths definitely belong to 1983, just as they did the rest of the mid to late 80s. But, you know, at the same time, a lot of the track list remains enduringly popular today for a good reason. One could also point towards some of the expectedly unique moments throughout this record, as Cyndi Lauper definitely had a bit of a flair to her own personality, musically speaking, early in her career that differentiated her from other pop stars of the era, with some of the reggae influences on Witness, for example, that kind of lean into the new wave sounds of this record that have the ever so slightest punky edge on a couple of tracks here or there that make this album feel like it's never just the great singles and then a collection of deep cuts thrown together. It really does feel like an album, with the A-side being super pop-oriented, whereas the B-side feels a bit more traditionally new wave in nature, with a lot of moments feeling kind of B-52s adjacent. I would say that this album is not necessarily super far off from the kind of stuff that you would hear from a post-debut B-52s record, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I'm never going to complain about that kind of sound. That style of pop rock with extremely light post-punk influences sprinkled in for good measure, it works with Cyndi super well here, especially because she leans into the pop side of things and really nails a lot of the hooks, melodies, and choruses that you find throughout She's So Unusual. You know, songs like All Through the Night, great choruses. The entire record is fun, has enough mellow moments to ensure that it feels like a well thought out album and not just a collection of good songs, which would have not been, the worst thing in the world, but still, it feels nice to listen to this record and actually feel like it's a cohesive record of pop music. I really have nothing negative to say about it, other than the track list never reaches the same heights that its two biggest singles do, but considering those are masterpieces of pop music and really some of the best mainstream music that the entirety of the 80s produced, I don't think that's really something worth bitching about overall. I don't know, I can't really find any way to complain about it. I don't have a ton to say about this album, honestly, because it's a record that's so popular, it's been discussed to death by both the mainstream music world and by critics alike. Not that I really fall into the category of either overall, but I digress. It's been a record that's had plenty of discussion surrounding it. It's one of the best-selling, most beloved, most iconic pop albums of a decade that produced a lot of iconic, best-selling, beloved pop music. So, yeah, it's just an outstanding record, and definitely one worth checking out if you somehow haven't been exposed to the greatness of Cyndi Lauper's debut. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Now, for the question, does Cyndi Lauper deserve to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And while I've seen her be a surprisingly polarizing figure for a lot of people who kind of question, does X artist deserve to be inducted, I honestly think that she's a great pick. I mean, there are only 2 women-led artists on this list this year, Cyndi Lauper and Mariah Carey, and both absolutely deserve induction. I'll get to Mariah Carey when I get to her, but for the time being, Cyndi Lauper, absolutely. Not only is it nice to just see the Hall induct more women in an institution where the list of inductees is over 90% dudes, but Cyndi Lauper is also one of the most iconic artists of her generation of MTV artists. Not only was she a pioneer of that particular era of popular music, but she's also one of the most enduring. I mean, I think there's a statement to be made that most of her music has aged better and still gets more airplay than a lot of her peers did, despite the fact that many of them achieved the same commercial success that she did at the time. So I definitely think that longevity comes into play here, and so does influence. The influence of Cyndi's early music is also a bit understated, whether you want to look at the 90s with Gwen Stefani and No Doubt, or modern popular music with artists like Olivia Rodrigo. A lot of them have their entire sound and style of women's empowerment at times being kind of in debt to Cyndi Lauper. Obviously, Cyndi Lauper was not the first woman in the music industry to stand her own ground. That goes back a century at this point, obviously, but, at the same time, I don't think that there were very many women in popular music like Cyndi Lauper that were really encouraging such positivity for women within the mainstream music industry at the time, especially coming after the 70s, where most of those women were forced in underground music scenes like the punk scene and the sort of proto-metal scene. It's kind of nice to have someone as massively successful as Cyndi Lauper be more than just a woman in music singing songs about men, or singing ballads, or doing love songs, the kind of things that women were expected to do in pop music for a very, very long time. She was a relatively groundbreaking artist for her era, and while I do think that her impact as far as women within popular music in the 80s goes was certainly overshadowed by a lot of other artists like Madonna, for example, it definitely is noteworthy that Cyndi Lauper was what she was at the time. Especially considering she was taken a bit more seriously than a lot of the disco artists that preceded her, like Donna Summer, that did the same thing first, but just were never really taken as serious artists or anything like that, unfortunately. Now, do I think that she will be inducted? Honestly, yeah. Probably. I would be relatively surprised if she didn't get in this year. I mean, she's been nominated once before. Everyone thought she was a lock then. She, wasn't. So I really do feel like this is probably her year. I think this is a similar situation to Pat Benatar, where she gets one nomination. Everyone thinks she's a lock because she's an extremely noteworthy woman in the history of popular music, but because of the Hall's seeming bias against women and solo female artists, they end up taking 2 nominations to get in because there's such an uproar about the fact that they didn't get in the first time. And I'm not even saying that because Cyndi Lauper is like my favorite musician of all time or anything. I'm not trying to be a shooter for Cyndi Lauper, for some reason, but, you know, at the same time, it really does feel like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is more eager to induct C-list, all-dude, all-white rock groups like Foreigner than they are solo female artists like Cyndi Lauper and Pat Benatar, who end up taking multiple nominations. And there's a conversation to be had about the institution's bias towards men specifically within the context of previous induction classes, especially early on in their history, but nonetheless, it's nice to see artists like Cyndi Lauper return to the ballot, and considering how much uproar there was around her lack of induction the first time around, I definitely do think that she'll get in this year, and if she doesn't, then, well, I mean, she's got to get in soon, because a lot of people are going to be pissed about that, and also, she's one of 2 women on the ballot this year. If the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame didn't induct any women in a year, that would just be kind of baffling and disappointing overall. So, I think she's got like a 85 to 90% chance. I would consider her the closest thing, or at least one of the closest things, that we have to a lock on the ballot this year. And with that being said, that is the end of this entry in the Rock Hall Review series. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.